Hi, this is Fabian Landry, and this is CodeDoc by Feel It. In this part of the CodeDoc story, we are going to continue from where we left off in the last session. In the last session, we went through an implementation of the Workday Calendar on F Sharp. We previously also went through this implementation on C Sharp. Today, we will continue working on this with unit tests. In the last video, we had a walkthrough of the F Sharp implementation of the Workday Calendar. And the video before that, we coded together and created the Workday Calendar for the C Sharp implementation. In this video, we are going to basically look at the implementation of a unit test for both these. The implementation of unit tests have already been done. We're simply gonna have a walkthrough. So without further ado, let's get started. To create a unit test project in the C Sharp implementation, which is the one on the top here, we right click on the solution and we choose add new project. We select C Sharp and we look for X unit test project. Let's see if we find it. There we have it, and we press next and write the project name, for example Workday Calendar.test, and click next. On the framework, you would select 7.0 here, that's 7.0, that's just fine, and press create. What will happen here is that you have a unit test file here, unit test 1 file, will affect decoration on the top of a method here, the test method, and an empty test method. Although the name of the class will be slightly different for you if you want to rename it, of course. We could do that right now. Let's rename it to test 2. This is just for illustration. And click yes. Now it has been renamed. And we could also rename the project by clicking on it and writing a different name. Let's write test project 2. And we see that it has been changed here. And we could change the namespace as well. Now, this is just an illustration, but I might as well show you the purpose of all of this. When you do a test, you want to write exactly what you're trying to test. And what I mean by that is we want to write tests for Workday Calendar. And for us to write tests for Workday Calendar, we require us to have a form of connection with the Workday Calendar project. But to do that, we will have to add it to this project, test project 2. And one way to do that is simply by right-clicking here and add project reference and select it here and OK. And we can see that has been added successfully by looking under the projects here, and we see the Workday Calendar C# project has been added. Now if you were to build this, we have to look at our output for a little bit. It says build succeeded. Now, you're probably wondering why am I showing you all of this, because this is what you would have to do on your end to be on par with what I've already done on my end. Now, if you look at Test Explorer window here, for you to access it, you will have to go to Test Explorer, and it will show up for you. You might have to move it around to a more suitable place on the Windows area. If you look under the test section here, you see that there's a few names: test project 2, and there's another one, unit test 2. This is basically referring to this file or this namespace, which is test project 2 and then unit test 2 class. If I were to click on it further, you will see that there's a test 1 and this refers to this method, test1. I could now right click on it and simply click on run. Now since there's nothing in this method, we expect this test to succeed, which it does. But if I were to write assert, which is a check for condition when you're doing tests, if I were to write assert true and then write, instead of true here, I write false, the test will now fail because we're expecting a true on this condition, where we pass in a false. To prove that, I would simply run the test. Let's widen our view a little bit. And you see that the test has failed. So what you would normally do, and that's what we will walk through on the C# implementation, is simply looking at ways to implement a test condition on different test criteria defined in the Workday calendar. So I'll just go ahead and open up my already prepared unit test project and close this. Simply go to solution, add existing project, and this should be it. My project is added, and let's look at the dependencies. And you see that I already added the field office work calendar C# project. I can safely remove this project now. Let's remove it and build this project, the one we've just imported. Now let's just look at our Workday calendar test file, which is the one containing the tests. Let's first look at the datestream format class here. What we want to do is assert a certain output based on this format. What that means will be explained a little bit further down. So let's just move on. The first method we're looking at, the first test method, is created holiday stores successfully. So let's do what we do inside here. The first thing we do is we create a Workday calendar, which is this class right here. The next thing we do, we simply create an instance of Workday calendar, initializing it through the default constructor or a constructor that's been publicly defined without parameters. Now, the next thing we do is define the Gregorian calendar, and we select calendar types localized to use the localized version of the Gregorian calendar. The next thing we do is to set holiday, because the intention of this method is to check that holiday stores successfully. So we set the holiday. The holiday we set is January 1st of 2004. We're gonna step through this to make things a little easier. The first assertion we check is that that day was a Thursday, and it should match whatever we have stored in the holidays when we set the holiday. The next assertion is to check that there's only one stored holiday. The next assertion is to check that the month type is January, as we've set here, of the stored holiday. And the next assertion is to check that it's not a recurring holiday, with assert false. Now let's go right ahead and step right through this. Put breakpoints on all the steps so you see more easily. Alright, let's go ahead and right click and select debug test. It's building, and build succeeded. We should stop at the start of the method pretty soon. Let's give some more leeway here. Alright, we stop. So the next thing we do is to step over and we analyze Workday calendar is currently null. That's simply because we haven't, this value doesn't exist yet and hasn't been instantiated. So the value is null. So the next thing we do is over it, or step over it, And we can see that it now has an instance of Workday Calendar, C# version. We step over Calendar and we see that it's an instance of the Gregorian calendar. We step over Set Holiday, set to January, and we step over the first assertion. No error so far, that means it has succeeded. The second assertion seems to have gone as it should. And if we look, it's a little bit hard to see now, but if we look at get stored holidays, return value, it returned 1. So there's only one holiday stored at the moment. Now let's check for the month type. So let's step over, succeeded, and we do the same for the year, 2004, succeeded, and we check to ensure that it's not a recurring holiday, and it succeeded. The next thing that should happen now is that our test succeeds or passes, because there's no other steps to evaluate. So let's press step over, and we should see a green check mark here, which indicates that our test, which is this test, has passed. And there's also a check mark over the method here. The next method is create recurring holiday stores successfully. Now you can see, if you look at this one, the only difference we did on the previous method is changing our assertion to true here, which is checking whether it's a recurring holiday or not. So let's just go right ahead and run this method. Let's right click, debug, no, right click run, sorry. And we should expect that the method succeeds or the test succeeds. So we have a green check mark here, which indicates that it succeeded. And we have a green check mark here, which indicates the same. Let's move on to the next test, which is titled created normal and recurring holiday on same date, stores only one recurring holiday. So how are we going to test that? Yeah, the first thing we do is instantiate the Workday calendar and the calendar as usual. Then we set the holiday to January 1st, 2004, and we set the recurring date to the same date, and this should produce only one holiday in the stored list. We don't want this to produce two different holidays. Now, let's just put a breakpoint here to ensure that we only have one single holiday stored, and debug the test. It shouldn't fail until that point. So if it fails after the point, the test has failed anyway, but until that point it shouldn't fail. We debug the test. There should be only one single holiday here, and since we have reached to this point, that means that the test has passed until this point. So now let's step over this, and this is it. And we should get a green mark here. Yeah, we did. And a green mark here. Now the next step on the next test is titled Created normal and recurring holiday on different dates stores both successfully. Now that the no regular holiday and the recurring holiday have different dates, we should expect them to store differently. So we should have two different holidays in our container. And the way to check about it is to check finally here that there's two at the container. After, of course, checking that each holiday has matches what we expect them to, the values we expect them to match. We expect them to match the day of the month, the year, and if it's recurring or not. The first one, which is a regular holiday, we expect it not to be recurring, whereas the second holiday, we expect to be recurring. Let's just go ahead and run the test. And it has succeeded, as we see a green mark on the top here, and a green mark here as well. Now we move on to the next test, which is created working hours start and stop stores successfully. If we were to look inside how we do that, we simply create an instance of Workday Calendar, then we set the working hours from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. and we check the expected time span of the start and the stop, and we check the difference between them, which should be exactly 8 hours. Now let's run this. And it has a green mark here and a green mark here as well, which means that it passed. Now we go ahead and test the criteria of our assignment. The first thing we do is we instantiate the Workday calendar. Then we instantiate the calendar with the recurring calendar. Then we declare a start date, the increment, and the output. You set equal to null here, but we don't really need to set it to null because we have nullable to enable. If you look at the project, not this project, but we look at this project, a nullable enable here, meaning that to set a string to null, we will have to first set the null here and then set it equal null. This works fine, but we are not gonna do that. We're simply gonna forget about the null for now. We're also not gonna set it here. Or actually, let's set them, but we set them to string empty, which is an empty string, and is equivalent to setting him to this. Sorry, this should be an equal to this. Now, let's go ahead and copy this string empty and paste it right here. So we have declared the start date as I mentioned, the increment, the output is initialized. This is where our assert data is going to be stored. More on it later. And work the end time based on increment. This is the time we expect to calculate or compute based on the increment we pass it. And the increment text, this is whether it should be increased or decreased. And we calculate that based on the sign, whether it's signed or unsigned, or whether it's plus or positive or negative value. So the next thing we do after creating all of this is set the working hours, which is 8 to 4 p.m. The recurring holiday should be May 17th and May 27th should be a holiday. Now, the first scenario, we have a start date the 24th of May 2004 at 6:05 or 18:05, and it's decreased by minus 5.5 working days, and we expect the end time to be 14:05 2004 at 12 p.m. So if you look at the scenario, we set the start date to 18:05 in this way. Then we set the increment to minus 5.5. Then the text is determined to be either increased or decreased based on this value. We could have simply moved this to a method and passed in the increment, but it's quite common in test domains to replicate code. This is a place you actually don't want to keep things dry. The reason for it is that creating a method would defeat the purpose of testing things. You don't want to introduce, because let's say there was something wrong with that method, turned out to be wrong, then the entire test will be affected. So you don't want to introduce other errors, to put it that way. So you actually just replicate code across the board, and in that way, in a sense, isolate problems. Now, the next thing we do is set the workday end time based on increment, which is simply a method we have already created in the Workday calendar by passing in the start date and the increment. Then the output is something we format using string interpolation, a combination of string interpolation, concatenate, and format the string to based on the date string format we've passed, which basically means that the DD stands for day, MM stands for month, YYYY stands for year, the uppercase HH stands for hours in 24 format, and the MM stands for minutes. So this is the format we expect our date to be on. So we basically try to replicate this text here, yeah, this text over here, and we assert equal the text that we generate here. We make sure that they are equal to the output we have generated here. So we expect the end time to be 12 p.m. on the 14th of May for this scenario. So let's just go ahead and run until that point. That would be here. Now, let's see. Yeah, that's correct. And let's debug. There we have reached our breakpoint. And if we were to step over now, it succeeded because there's no error. The next scenario, we are not going to stop the breakpoint because we actually want to. Let's go ahead because and stop it because it will probably be easier to see what's going on here. So we stop the breakpoint and we set collapse the region. Now we expect the second scenario, 24th of May 1903, to with 44 increased by 44.723656 working days. So you have the end time at the 27th of July 2004, 13:47. We basically have done everything the same as the previous step, except that we have changed the increment to that value and the expected string, which is this. Now if we set the breakpoint here and run this, debug. Now let's see what happens. It stops right there. After your step passed, so we will expect to reach this breakpoint. So let's press step over and it passes. So we stop the breakpoint and stop the test, and we look at the next one. The next one scenario is start date 24th of May 2004, 1803, increased by minus 6.7470217 working days. The end time should be 13th of 5 2004 at 10:02. Now I expected this to be 10:02, but my answer is 10:01. So now look at the implementation. We see that the only thing that's basically different here is our increment, which is set to minus 6.7470217 float, and this text basically, which has changed to 10:01 to make it work with my results. The ideal result is probably 10:01 and roughly 30 seconds, just under 30 seconds. So in a sense, this could be a correct result, but I feel that this seems more right. If you disagree or you believe that the correct result should be 10:04, please post your solution or your argumentation for why it should be the case. So let's go ahead and run our test and check that what I said actually is the case, at least in this setup and based on my Workday Calendar code. We go to the top, we right click and we debug the test. Then we stopped here, meaning now that we can step over and expect it to pass, which it did. So let's stop the test and move on. The next scenario is starting at 3 past 8 and with an increment of 12.782709 working days. Should expect to have an end time at the 10th of June 2004 at 14:18. Now with an increment of 12.782709 and expected output to be this, let's go ahead and debug the code. There, stop there, and we can step over to our next scenario, which went well. The next scenario is starting at 7:0 on the 24th of May, 7:03, increased by 8.276628, and time should be the 4th of June 2004 at 10:12. Now let's go ahead and check this. We remove this breakpoint, and we right click and debug tests, and step over. It went well. Now the next scenario is starting at 5 past 3 p.m., increased by 0.25 working days, and time should be 9:05. The only difference is our increment here to 0.25 and start date and the check against the output. I put the breakpoint here, right click and debug test. And it's stopped and everything should work if I just press a step over, which it did. The next scenario is 1505, sorry, increased by 0.25 working days, and time 25 the 25th of May 2004 at 5 past 9. So let's check this for accuracy. We debug this. We forgot to remove the breakpoint on our previous, but let's just press continue, and we reached it. Now let's step over. Everything went fine. Now let's look at the next scenario, which starts on the 24th of May, 04 a.m., increased by 0.5 working days, and time is expected to be at 12 p.m. the very same day. Now let's go ahead and check it. And right click debug tests. And step over. And it worked. The next thing we want to do is check the next scenario, which is the 24th of May, 4 a.m., increased by positive 0 working days, and time is expected to be the 24th of May at 8 a.m. Now, the only increment is set to plus 0.0 float, and we notice, pay attention, we have a 0 working day set here, and we expect the end time to be at 8 a.m. the very same day. So let's put the breakpoint here and right click and debug tests. Now we again forgot to remove the breakpoint on that previous test. Let's press on continue, and we step over, and it should be fine. Now the next test is quite similar to the previous one, except that we have, instead of plus 0.0, we have minus 0.0. So we want to ensure that 0 plus 0 and minus 0 is the same thing. But notice here that the expected value to be checked up against is minus 0, not 0. But it's basically the same value we expect, the same end time we expect. So there is a difference here, but we expect the same end time. So let's go and debug our test. Now let's choose debug test to get to the point we want to be. Now it stopped. Let's step over. Everything seems to be in order. Let's remove the breakpoint, and the next scenario is starting from 11 p.m. on the 24th and increased by 2 working days. We expect the end time to be 4 p.m. on the 26th. So let's go ahead and do the check here against this with the increment of 2 working days. So put the breakpoint here, and we can basically press continue because we haven't made any changes. And the next thing that happens is that we press step over and nothing in particular stopped. So that means we're good to go. Now, before we continue on the next scenarios, we want to change the working hours from 8 p.m. to 4 p.m. to 11 p.m. to from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. So let's look at the first scenario after we've done that. So let's step over. The first scenario is starting from 11 p.m. and adding it by 2 working days. We expect to end at 7 a.m. the 26th of May 2004. So let's put a breakpoint here. Now let's step over. It worked. And the final criteria we decided to test is to check 5 from 2305 increased by 2 working days, and we expect the end time to be the 26th of May 2004, 2305, which basically means that whoever has the schedule will have to work to 7 a.m. the 26th of May 2004 and then return to work 5 minutes the very next day. Let's hope nobody's that unlucky. Let's check the output to ensure that this actually is what happens. Let's press continue and step over. Perfect. Now let's step over the method and we should see that the test passed. So if we were to run all tests together, if we run here, they all passed. Now let's look at the equivalent of that was the C# implementation of our unit test. Let's look at the equivalent of F# implementation by just walking through the code. First of all, let's import our project, add existing project. It should be this test project. Let's attempt to build it. Let's do a rebuild. I hope that everything works as it should. Alright, we have a F# test project in order. We press on tests here. And we should see, we might as well make it bigger now since we're done with the C# implementation. Let's do remove, delete all breakpoints. Alright. The first one, simply create a holiday and check that it's stored successfully. We want to do the same thing on F#, and that is simply straightforward. As you can see there, only cosmetic changes. The concept is basically the same, except that we solve it this way. For checking Thursday, we basically check for the first item in the list. There's only one item stored. Doesn't matter if it's first or last that's used there. But we check for the first item in the list and then pass for the day of the week. We pass return the day of the week from that first item. And we do the same thing for the month, the day of the month type, the year, and is recurring property. Now let's locate the test in the navigation window, and we see the test. We found the test here. Let's just run this particular test, and we see that it passed. Let's move on to the next test, which is create recurring holiday store successfully. We see that we've done basically the same here as on C#, but instead of checking for the last, we're checking for the first item. And since there's only one item in the list, it doesn't really matter if we check for the first or the last. Let's go ahead and run this test, and it passed. Now the next test is created normal and recurring holiday on the same date. Stores only recurring and it succeeds. Only difference is that we check for the first item instead of the last because we only expect one, and we check for the single here, which should indicate that there's only one item, just like on C# implementation. So let's go ahead and run this test. And he passed. Let's move on. So we look at the created normal and recurring holiday on different dates, stored both successfully. Now let's look at, we expect to have two items. We see that the first item we're storing is a regular holiday. We check for the first occurrence. And the second item we basically checking for the item as position 1. There appears to be an issue here. As you know, it should be list item 1 here instead of list head, but it's the same month, so it doesn't really matter. If there were two different months on the test, we would expect to check for list item 1, and this is what we're doing now. So let's run this test and expect it to succeed. Let's move to the next test, which is basically setting the working hours, creating the working hours, and then checking that the values are as they're supposed to be. Now let's do the same on F#. We set the working hours from 8 to 16, and we perform the check like this, about the same way we do it on C#. We can simply remove the new here and got exactly the same result. The same with times man. We remove the new and get exactly the same result. Now let's look at this test. And it passed. Now this final test, which is the criteria test, we simply gonna go through it. We have chosen to define the date string format inside the method because it's the only place it's used. But beside that, we are basically doing the same thing as we're doing on C#, except that some of the values that are initiated are different. Now let's just move on and see how things pan out. We set the working hours just as on C#, recurring holiday and holiday. We have the first scenario, which is basically like this. We assign values just the same way we assign them on C#, so there's nothing new here. We have the second scenario, which looks like this. And we have the third scenario, which looks like this. You see that this actually less code somewhat in F#. Now let's move on to the next scenario, which is the 24.803, and look at the difference. Nothing new here actually, so let's move on to 703 of May 2004. See the difference? It's basically a replication of code, which is allowed during testing, in my opinion. Now let's look at scenario 2404-2004, with the only difference being here basically and here, and on the check on the output. Now let's look at 2405-2004 at 4 a.m., which looks like this, and at 2405-2004 at 4 a.m. increased by 0 working days, and it looks like this. The same thing can be the case with our results. If we were to look at minus 0.0 working days, which it seems to be wrongly labeled here. Now, let's look at the next one. Increased by 2 working days. It looks like this. And then we change the start to stop time, which we do here. We remove this and this. And we probably can remove this. And we see the difference. Less code, of course. Let's move on to the next scenario, which starts at 2305. Yeah, and it looks like this. We can do the same here. Remove this. And I think that's it. Yeah. So we can run the final test on F sharp. That's basically it with unit testing. And as you can see, the implementation are quite similar with the unit test on F sharp versus C sharp. The syntax, of course, is a little bit different, but the implementation, the concept, is basically the same thing. So that's basically it. We have implemented the unit testing, and we have verified that our implementation passes the test criteria, and that's basically all we wanted to do, which basically means that our implementation of Workday Calendar works according to the test criteria minus the little issue we have here with 1001. I believe this is the correct answer. But of course, the test criteria could be the correct one. If you agree with the test criteria, please state your opinion about why that is the case. But I believe the test criteria is faulty. I believe this, but we will figure out the right answer soon enough. We'll be certain of which one is correct. That's it for now. I will invite you to please subscribe, like our post, and comment if you have anything to add. Take care.